Okay, so are you guys ready to do the last video for chapter 1? It's a long chapter and we had a lot of information to cover, but we're almost done. So we're going to talk a little bit about the research model. This is really important in terms of sociology and what we do in sociology. A lot of times people can get the impression that sociology isn't based on research, that sometimes what your professor is talking about might be their own opinion. We tend to believe a lot of things when we discuss societal issues, those are a matter of opinion. And for many people, they might be a matter of opinion. But when we're talking about it in terms of sociology, and we're talking about basic definitions and discussions, there's always some research to back this up, which means there's facts and empirical evidence and that kind of thing. So the first thing that we end up doing in sociology is going through the very kind of tedious process of explaining to you guys as brand new students the research model and how we come about with some of the main ideas that we have. So the research model is outlined for you here. The very first thing we do is select a topic. So I might select a topic like race and racism. And then we define the problem within the topic. And usually you're guided by your theory, and you may possibly have already read literature on this topic. We tend to specialize, so we may start a topic having already known quite a bit of information. But even when you don't, you would be guided by maybe social conflict theory, and you're looking at something like race. And then you have to define the problem. And when we say define the problem, what is the actual issue that you're looking at in society? What is the problem? Is, race relations on a macro level. So what is the issue in terms of how blacks versus whites are treated when they go in to obtain medical treatment? And that's a problem, and I'm defining it in a kind of concrete way, something that I can actually start working on, right? So then we go into reviewing the literature, and when you review the literature, this is not the same thing as people will say, oh, I'm doing research, meaning they Googled stuff. Now, when you Google something, you're pulling up all kinds of information that's from the World Wide Web that anybody can actually write in there. A lot of it can be biased, and a lot more of it is just simply incorrect. When we say review the literature, when we're talking science, what we're doing is we're reviewing academic, peer-reviewed articles. So peer-reviewed means that one professor or doctor of this particular specialization has written an article, done research. He sends it in to a journal, and that journal has 6 or 7 or 8 other people who are specialists in that field also review that person's article to see if it's appropriate for publication, if there's not any serious issues, if they're not being biased, if they have used empirical evidence, if they've followed the research model. So you review the literature. You might also hear this called a lit review, and you might have to do this in your academic future. Then you formulate a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a statement about how certain events in the world may work. And you're looking at some kind of connection or lack of connection between two variables. We just talked about this a little bit ago. So we can look at what is the connection between being on your phone, looking at Facebook, and neck problems, right? So the two variables would be time on your phone and having problems with your back or your neck or feeling pain, right? So that there might be some sort of connection. Now, in doing so, you have to have what we call operational definitions. Operational definitions is a definition, a concrete enough definition that if someone else came to repeat your research, they could. So when you say looking at your phone, you would have to describe what that actually means. Holding it in your hand, having it on, using the other hand to scroll up or down, and in some way engaging in your phone, maybe on Facebook or Twitter or Googling, whatever else it is you might be doing. And then the other thing that you would have to operationalize and give a real definition for is neck problems or back pain. You'd have to describe what that actually means, what constitutes back pain, what is not considered to be back pain or neck problems, that kind of thing. Then you choose your research method or your design. So research method means how you're going to collect your data. And we've probably heard about qualitative and quantitative data. And so qualitative data tends to be more holistic. It gives you a bigger picture. Quantitative data tends to, and also, I just gave it to you wrong. Qualitative data tends to be more in-depth and gives you an in-depth understanding of something, whereas quantitative data is more holistic and is going to give you a big picture. Quantitative data is often also numbers. One is not necessarily better than the other. They both have very strong qualities to them and are used for different reasons and often today used together in combination. Then you collect your data. And in collecting your data, you are concerned with being as valid and reliable as possible. So when we say valid, when I intend on measuring how long people are on their phone, I don't want to have one researcher, say I have 3 people working for me and they're timing how long people are on their phone in any 24-hour given period. If they all use different ways of when the person actually starts and when they're done and how they chose to record, one person's a little more flexible about it and one person's, doesn't count if, doesn't count it if somebody's looking at their phone, but they're not looking at something online. They only count if people are looking online. And then the second person counts everything. If somebody's looking at text, they're online, or they're talking on their phone. That's not going to be a very valid definition. And it's also not going to be reliable in terms of a time estimate because you're not having consistency over time and you're not having reliability in terms of measuring what you intend on measuring and measuring it the same way each time. Then once we've collected this data, we want to analyze our results. So when we say analyze our results, what we're talking about is to look at the data and to then interpret it, usually from one of the theoretical perspectives, in order to represent a deeper understanding of what that data means, as opposed to just giving straight facts. That's not necessarily analyzing, because if you just say, A, B, and C, person A, B, and C were on their phone for 30 minutes, and person D, E, and F were on their phone for 45 minutes, that doesn't really give you a good idea. It's very just descriptive and not in depth. Then we share our results, and when we share our results, we mean we write articles that are published. We present these articles in this research at conferences, and it gets disseminated through publication, articles, books, teaching, lectures, seminars, that kind of thing. So here's just another way to look at it. This is more visual, especially if it can be a little difficult to understand when you're looking at it or when you're just listening to those steps in sequence. So we start here with defining their problem. So that's selecting the topic for research. So say my topic for research is, I'm curious about ice cream consumption and weather, right? So I'm going to then define the problem. Well, there's not really an issue with that, right? I mean, that's not really a societal issue. So even though it's a topic and I could do research on it, is this really an issue that is a problem for society? Well, no, not necessarily. So sociologists might not do it. But a person who sells ice cream might want to do this as a market research kind of issue or problem, right? Then you review the literature. So you review other people who have discussed or done research on this topic. Then you select your design, which is your method, what we were talking about before. Your research method is how you're going to go about doing the research. Is it going to be qualitative, quantitative, some combination of both? Are you going to do surveys? Are you going to observe people while they're working? What is the most appropriate way to gather your data? And you spell that out so that if somebody replicates it, or wants to replicate it, they can, and then you use exactly that method. Then you formulate your hypothesis. So you think there may be a correlation between hot weather and ice cream consumption, right? If you're doing some type of market research. Then you carry out your research. So that's when you actually do the research method that you decided. So since I'm concerned with ice cream consumption and heat, I decided that my two variables are the weather, the temperature outside, and the amount of ice cream people eat. So maybe I decided my method is that I'm going to do observational method. So I'm going to record the time and the temperature every single day for 3 months. And then I'm going to go to my local ice cream store, shop, I guess, and I'm going to count the number of people who ordered ice cream and the correlating temperature, right? That's actually carrying out my research. Then I'm going to interpret my results. So I'm going to analyze them from a theoretical perspective. Now, this is a pretty flat kind of market level research. So there's not really a lot of interpreting and analyzing. A lot of it is just going to be descriptive. You know, you're saying what time it is and you're saying if people ate ice cream or not. So it's not the most robust research, but you could end up interpreting or analyzing this in that the higher the temperature outside, the higher level of ice cream consumption or sales the local ice cream shop will have. The lower the temperature outside, the lower level of ice cream consumption and sales the ice cream shop would have. Then you report your research findings. In that case, you might want to report to the local ice cream shops or ice cream vendors, because that might be actually useful for them. And then you repeat your research if it's needed. And so that's kind of your steps in this kind of circular method, and it gives you a nice visual description of how we do it. So I mentioned already qualitative and quantitative. So what is qualitative and quantitative research? Well, qualitative research, more specifically, is kind of semi-structured data collection. We're talking about you might go and do an interview with somebody and you have a set of questions, but if they add information, you're not going to make them strictly adhere or just omit that information. You're going to take that in. So you might, it's semi-structured in that you might have 10 questions you plan on asking these individuals, but, if other questions come up or other information comes up, it may very well be useful to your research, and so you collect that as well. You'll record it on your audio recording, type it up, that kind of thing. There's also what we call open-ended. So when you ask someone an open-ended question, how do you feel about these 3 flavors of ice cream, chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry? That's very different than a closed-ended question where you would say, which ice cream is your favorite, chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry? So as you can see, a quantitative question would simply be measuring how many people have a favorite of chocolate, how many people have a favorite of vanilla, and how many people have a favorite of strawberry. We tend to do qualitative research with smaller populations. And the reason why is because you're collecting more information from each individual. We tend to do larger populations more likely to do quantitative research where you're collecting a small amount of information from a larger amount of people. So if I wanted to tell you what predominantly is the favorite ice cream of Californians, I would most likely do quantitative research because I can ask a large number of people what their favorite ice cream is. I can tally that up. I have a simple and well-defined measure, numbers. It's going to be a certain number of people. I can express it numerically, and then I can tell you how many people, what percentage of the population, 60% have a favorite of chocolate, 30% have a favorite of strawberry, and only 10% of people like vanilla. Obviously, that's biased because I like chocolate. So, if I was more curious about a different type of question, why do people prefer vanilla over chocolate? Then I'm more likely to do qualitative research. That's a complex and in-depth understanding. So I am more likely to ask you, why do you think you like chocolate, or why do you think you like vanilla? And obviously it's not going to be a one-word answer. It's probably going to be a paragraph, a conversation, a few pages once you've written it down. But you'll have a more in-depth understanding of why people's favorite is chocolate over strawberry or vanilla over chocolate. Okay, so the methods that we were talking about. So some of the most common methods of research that we do are surveys, and you've probably experienced this in terms of market research. You see surveys all the time. People will ask you, can be a short or long survey. They'll ask you both qualitative and quantitative questions, so open-ended questions or closed-ended questions. And you, as the person who is responding, is called the respondent. And it's very important when, in terms of getting an unbiased representation of a group of people, if I were doing research on ice cream, I can't just simply ask people in my community who happen to be factory workers at a vanilla ice cream Bluebell shop what their favorite ice cream is, because chances are most of them are going to say that their favorite ice cream is vanilla. So the first thing we start with is the population. Who is it that we want to study? So if I wanted to study the favorite ice cream of Californians, everybody in California who calls themselves a resident of California or who lives in California would be considered part of my population. I have to define that. Am I going to include people who consider themselves Californian but no longer live here? Am I going to include people who live here but don't consider themselves from California? So I define my population. It's a little bit different terminology than if you were to use the word population in everyday speech. In everyday speech, population means a number of people. But in research and sociology, population means the characteristics of the people that you are interested in. From that population, I do get a number. So if I know that the population of California is, say, 40 million, there's actually a way that I can calculate an appropriate sample for that number. And I'm not going to get into how to do that. That's a little bit into statistics. But say, for example, that our population was 10,000, we would use this formula and figure out what would be a good representative sample. You have to have a number high enough to have actually kind of gathered a good representation of what the whole population is thinking. And that's the sample size that you need. So for a population of 10,000, you might need a sample of 3,720. And you want that sample usually to be as random as possible. And random meaning that you're not just picking people from one community or people that are convenient to you. You're picking people from all facets of life, from all different areas that are different races and classes and genders and different religion and work at different jobs so that you can get a nice representative sample. Sometimes that's not possible, so we do what's called a stratified random sample. And that simply means that, say for example, I wanted to look at how a particular program in California schools was doing. And so what I decided to do was I was going to do an evaluation of this program. But this program, there's 1,300 of them in the school, and I can't do every single one. So I want to get a sample. But I can't do a complete random sample because I don't have an exact list of every single different one and their information. So I might do a what we call a stratified random sample to make it easier on me to choose, because I want to choose from all over California. Stratified random sample would do something like this. I would randomly pick maybe 10 counties from California, and then from those counties I could randomly pick several cities from each one of those counties, and then from each one of those counties I would pick several school districts, and from those school districts I would pick several schools to evaluate their program, and that's what we would call a stratified random sample. So hopefully that was fairly straightforward. Now let's get into what we call field work. Now I've picked which schools I want to evaluate, and I need to actually go and collect my data. So when I go out to the school and I decide to do my participant observation, I'm going to be actually helping with the program, and I'm going to be observing and recording at the same time. That's called field work. You're basically going out and doing the work out in the field, which is why it's called field work. It's participant observation because you're actually helping with the program while you're observing. If you just stand by and watch, and you don't discuss anything, you don't participate, you're not involved, but you're observing and you're recording, that's what they call direct observation. When they know you're there, you have direct observation that is obtrusive. When they don't know you're there, it's called unobtrusive observation. And sometimes we do that kind of unobtrusive observation because when people know they're being observed, they change their behavior. So sometimes we can get skewed results simply because people are being observed. Are you guys tired yet? I'm tired. So moving on to case studies. So case study is simply, you often hear about case studies in terms of psychology. They'll study this particular person, their case with their psychological issues. Sociologists don't really do case studies a lot. Oftentimes they do, if they do a case study, it's on an organization or some type of event or some type of program that's going on, where you can study just that program, just that event, just that organization. Because we're not doing individual studies on people as sociologists, our case studies would be more likely to be like organizational case studies. We also do what we call secondary analysis. So secondary analysis simply means that somebody else has already collected the data, and we use that collected data and we do an analysis of it. So you see this often with a lot of large scale quantitative research projects. And the most common bank of data that sociologists use a lot of times is the census. And the census collects a ton of information on race and class and job types and income and all kinds of different stuff, religion. And so it's a great resource for being able to look at large-scale projects in terms of large-scale data sources and doing analysis on those. Document analysis is simply when you are analyzing documents. So today that's becoming actually more and more common. And in the past, a lot of times when you were doing document analysis, you were looking at actual paper documents. Maybe your school has essays from students, why they want to attend that college, and you decide you wanted to do a document analysis, and you're looking at paper essay after paper essay of this and doing an analysis on why students want to attend that particular college. But today, with the advent of social media, there's becoming more and more of an availability of document analysis being done on social media. So researchers will use things like Facebook, Twitter, that kind of stuff as a way to gain insight into people's understanding or views on a particular topic, maybe a political topic or a racial issue or a sexual issue or something like that. And that's a lot of the reason why you have what we call data mining. Data mining is really what companies do. And a lot of times when you get those Facebook posts that say, oh, hey, like this or share if you believe kittens are cute or something like that. That's ridiculous, that everybody obviously believes, right? A lot of times what they're doing is data mining. The second you hit like or share, they collect all your information. Remember, you set up a profile. So they know your name, your address, where you live. I already said that. What you like, everything you've ever hit like on, so what you buy, what you're interested in. They're data mining. They're getting data from you so that they could better sell you more things. That's essentially what data mining is. Okay. And then last is experiments. So control groups, experimental groups, independent variables, and dependent variables. So an experiment essentially means that this is what when people think of science or scientific research, a lot of times they're thinking of an experiment, and they're thinking of a control experiment where you have people who are going into either an experimental group or a control group. And a lot of times we think about this in terms of medicine. So let's do this. Okay. So the standard experiment is often two different groups. One is your control group, and the other one is your experimental group, right? So your experimental group, let's do this. Your control group are being told that they're getting some type of benefit or maybe medication. And your experimental group is actually getting the benefit, the medication, whatever it is. So you have these two groups, and you have one group who gets the medication. So you actually do the experiment on them, and then you test them afterwards. So use an R. This is more effective. So you might actually say, for example, you're looking at blood pressure medication, and you want to see if this blood pressure medication works. So you would take the blood pressure of both groups. For the control group, you are not going to actually give them the drug. So they are not getting any kind of medication. And then you're going to wait another 6 weeks or so, and then you are going to, this is not working out, there you go, and then you're going to take their blood pressure again. With the experiment group, you actually give them take their blood pressure, give them their medication, and take their blood pressure again. And then you would compare to see if there's any change. If there's no difference between the two groups, chances are the medication didn't work. But what if you think it may take, it may only work for a short amount of time? So you have different options in the way that you could design this. Maybe I only want to take their blood pressure after. So I don't even know what their blood pressure is before. I don't give the control group medication. I give the experimental group medication. I take their blood pressure 1 week after, and I take their blood pressure 1 week after. And I am able to look at whether or not there's a change. But I have a problem because I don't know what was before. But essentially, that's the way an experiment works. And there's a couple different ways in which you can design it. One of the traditional ways is what they call the Solomon Group 4, but you guys don't need to know that. And we have talked about almost everything. The last thing we need to talk about is the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And the way that I like to talk about these two things or remember them, because they can be a little bit challenging. A dependent variable changes based on the independent variable. So ice cream sales increase based on weather. So ice cream sales are the dependent variable and the weather is independent. So the weather does not change based on ice cream sales, but ice cream sales change based on weather. And the way you can remember this, because it's important to remember, and it can be a little challenging sometimes because it can be confusing, is I like to personalize it. So I always like to joke and say that I'm the independent variable and my husband's emotions are dependent on mine. So if I'm upset, he's upset. And he's the dependent variable because his emotions are based on mine, but mine are not based on his, right? So I'm independent and he's dependent. I told him I use this example in all my classes. Generally, people laugh at my dumb jokes. It works out pretty well. On video, obviously not. But he said it was the other way around. So it's probably true. I could be upset and he's fine. And if he gets upset, I get upset too, because I don't like him to be upset. So even though I'd like to say I'm the independent variable, chances are I'm probably the dependent variable in that relationship. That brings us to assignment 2, Blackboard. And so we're all done with our lecture videos. Thank you very much. Your next video will be how to do assignment 2 on Blackboard. Have a great day.